Today, we are continuing our series, Investigating Jesus, and today we are going to be in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 23. And I want to start by today asking you, have you ever been the recipient of some person's grace in your life? Like they did something for you that you didn't deserve, it was unmerited, you didn't earn it, but just out of their kindness and their goodness to you, like they offered you forgiveness when you didn't deserve it, or they gave you something and you didn't deserve it, or they went out of their way and they completed a task for you, even though you didn't ask them to do that. Have you ever had anything like that in your life? I remember when I was in my second semester of seminary education, and we had just found out Beth was pregnant, she was going to have a baby, and she was working at the campus, so I got some discount on my seminary education, and she was going to quit working. And so as the second semester began, I got a notice from the finance office at the seminary that I needed to come and see them. Now, if you've never been in education, when you get a notice from the finance office, it never ends well for you, okay? And so I just started thinking about, like, how much money do I owe them? And I don't really have enough money to pay them. Came and I was going into the finance office. I was running through every possible scenario that I could imagine, and almost one penny for tuition this semester. And she went on and she told me that this was donated. And honestly, I have no idea, even to this day, who is the person that gave that. No way to pay them back. I could not figure out who this person could be. And I left the office that day just astounded by the grace that someone would show to me. Somebody did something so amazing and so kind for me that I could never even repay, even if I wanted to. And the truth is, when people show us grace, sometimes it makes us a little uncomfortable, right? Because we have been trained our entire childhood has been based around the idea that we get things like, if we work hard enough, if we behave well enough, then typically things will kind of work out in our favor. And that's why, we grow up and we have chore charts and report cards and recitals and sporting tryouts, and we move on into life and we get scholarships and we get promotions and raises and all of this stuff. But all of it in our entire life is based upon merit, that if we do something or work hard enough, then we will achieve this. What happens sometimes is that what happens in our everyday life sometimes creeps into our spiritual life. And sometimes we believe that our transactions with God are the same way. If I just modify my behavior enough, or if I can just do enough of the right things and stop doing enough of the wrong things, then I will experience God's grace in my life. But today, as we continue to investigate Jesus, I want you to leave here today with a very important truth, and that's this, is that Jesus is gracious towards us. See, there's nothing that we can do that we can earn God's grace, or there's nothing that we are that merits grace in our life, that just simply Jesus is gracious towards us. And that's what we're going to discover today as we continue to investigate Jesus. We're going through the Gospel of Luke, and I told you the very first week we started this series, Luke declared at the beginning of the writing of his Gospel that he thoroughly investigated everything. That everything that we read about in the Gospel of Luke was there because Luke went and he talked to the eyewitnesses. He talked to the people who were there. He interviewed the people who heard what Jesus said or saw the miracles that Jesus performed. And Luke said, after I did all of this investigation, I wrote it all down for you, so that you would know and understand ultimately the identity of Jesus. And so we've named this series Investigating Jesus, and we're walking through the Gospel of Luke, and we're looking at these amazing events and these amazing teachings that Jesus had in his life that demonstrate fully, finally, and forever Jesus' great identity towards us. And when we understand the fullness of Jesus' identity, it ought to transform the way we view him and the way we think about him. If Jesus ultimately is who he said he was, then He's not somebody that we can just put on a shelf. It's not somebody that we can just kind of ignore. It's not somebody that we can just have a laissez-faire attitude towards. That if he is who he said he is, it ought to change the way we live. And that's why our memory verse is Luke chapter 24, and it tells us, whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. He said, if he is who he said he is, then it requires us to sacrifice and to give up our lives in order to follow after him. Because ultimately, if he is who he said he is, he's the only one that can provide life. And that's what we're going to discover today as we discover that Jesus is gracious. So we started the first week, and we saw in the first week that Jesus is perfect. He faced all those temptations by the devil after he had been fasting for 40 days, and Jesus succeeded everywhere that you and I have failed in our lives. And as a result of that, we are to trust his perfection, not our performance, because we can't perform well enough for God. The second week, we saw there that Jesus is the authority, how he commanded the fish to jump into the nets, and they caught so many fish that the boat started to sink, and Peter comes to the shore, and Jesus said to him, why don't you just leave everything and come follow me? And they realized that he was one with authority, so they left everything behind. The fish, the business, their friends, their family, they left it all behind, and they went and they followed Jesus. Week number 3, we saw that Jesus is the final word. That as he stood there on the Mount of Transfiguration, he was standing there with Moses and Elijah, and he was speaking to the law and the prophets, and ultimately Jesus fulfilled all the law. He fulfilled all the prophets. Moses and Elijah vanished, and Jesus was there alone, signifying that he has the final word. And as a result of that we should heed, we should listen, we should obey the words of Jesus in every aspect of our lives. And then we saw that Jesus is available. We saw this last week, and how Jesus told that story about the 2 sons, and one went off into a remote country and he spent all of his wealth and sinful living. The older son stayed there and he was the good son, but both sons were far from Jesus. One was far from his father. One was far away in his unrighteousness. One was far away in his self-righteousness. And I encourage you, wherever you are, whichever one you identify with today, because most of you said to me last week, I identify with both of them, join the club, okay? So wherever you are today, Jesus is available. So just come home to Jesus. Leave your unrighteousness, leave your self-righteousness, and just come home to Jesus because he is available. And today, very powerful reading in the Gospel of Luke, where we're going to discover that Jesus is gracious. This is traditionally what we call Palm Sunday. It's the day in which we celebrate the triumphal entry of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. He was riding on a donkey, and people were throwing the palm branches and their coats down before him, and they were shouting out, Hosanna in the highest. And the religious leaders came and they said to Jesus, you need to tell these people to be quiet. And Jesus responded, he said, if they don't shout out, even the stones that we walk on will shout out to the glory of God. And then Jesus spent a week there in Jerusalem. He went in and he cleansed the temple. He was questioned and trying to be tested by the religious leaders. He went and visited his friends in Bethany that were just living just outside of the city of Jerusalem. And then finally, near the end of the week, he gathered his disciples together and they celebrated the Passover in the upper room. He sent Judas out to do what Judas ultimately was going to do. He took his band of followers and they went out of the city and up onto the Mount of Olives, and Jesus spent some time praying. And Judas, the betrayer, brought Roman soldiers with him, betrayed Jesus with a kiss. And then most Bible scholars believe that Jesus endured 6 different trials. There was Pilate, and there was Herod, there was the religious leaders. And then finally, Jesus was brought back for a final time to stand before Pilate. And Pilate didn't really want to convict Jesus to the sentence of death, and so he tried to reason with the people. And he even offered, he said, hey, I'll give you a choice. We have this one who is in jail right now. He's in there. His name is Barabbas. and he's in prison because he started an insurrection and he's a murderer. He said, or you can have this Jesus who really has done nothing wrong. It's up to you. And the crowd cried out, release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. And then Luke described what happened after that. And I'm going to actually begin reading in chapter 23, beginning in verse 24. And here, after Pilate had heard all this, Pilate pronounced sentence and their demand be granted. So he released Barabbas. He released a man they were asking for who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus. And with one wave of the hand, Pilate had sentenced Jesus to death. What would have happened there is they would have taken Jesus, we know, the scourged, and they placed his head, and then they would have made him carry a crossbeam that weighed approximately 100 pounds out of the city of Jerusalem to a place just outside of the city. It was a place called the Place of the Skull. And it would have been right there at the entrance of the city, so the people, as they were coming and going, could see the consequences of disobeying the Roman authorities. And here they are, and in verse 32, Luke described there were two others also who were criminals. They were being led away to be put to death with him. Now here, Luke tells us that these two were criminals. Now this is an important part of the narrative here. And Matthew and Mark refer to them as thieves. However, the word that Luke used here is a compound word that means evildoer. These were some bad dudes. And actually, the word that's used by Matthew and Mark is translated thieves, but they were more than just petty thieves. It was a word that carried the idea that they were marauders, not from Bishop Guilfoyle, but they were marauders, okay? And they were more than just petty criminals. They were people who robbed and then took great enjoyment in harming and sometimes even killing the people that they were attacking. So these are the people that Jesus finds himself with. And there's many who believe that Jesus is the third one, the cross that technically should have been Barabbas' cross. Barabbas and likely his two associates should have been executed that day just outside of Jerusalem. And then Luke wrote in verse number 33, when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. Now, here Luke, he summed it all up just by simply saying they crucified him, because Luke understood that the people in the first century would have had a vivid understanding of what it meant to be crucified. Likely, they took Jesus there to the place of the skull, along with the two criminals. And they would have laid them down on their back on that crossbeam that they had carried out of the city. And a soldier probably would have put one foot in Jesus' armpit while another soldier twisted and pulled on his wrist until his shoulder was pulled out of socket. They would have laid his arm down and they would have driven a spike down through the joint where the wrist and the hand meet together. They would have went to the other side and they would have done the same thing there. They would have attached that crossbeam to the upright that was lying there, and there they would have placed one foot over the other, and they drove a spike down through the top foot, through the heel, into the wood, fulfilling that great prophecy of Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. You will bruise his heel, but he will crush your skull. And then they would have taken that cross and they would have tipped it up in the air and let it sink down into the hole. And likely we had this vision of crosses being way up in the air, but likely Jesus' feet would have been about 2 or 3 feet off the ground. Close enough that everybody could have seen the expressions on his face, the agony that they went through. And what this did was this fulfilled what Romans expected to do through crucifixion. Though they didn't invent crucifixion, they used crucifixion as their primary means of execution. And it led to public humiliation. It led to public spectacle and shame. It prolonged death. And there was just unrelenting agony as a person died on the cross. So here was Jesus along with these two criminals, and he's hanging on the cross. And then in verse number 34, Luke wrote this. He said, "But Jesus was saying, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.' And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves." That fulfills the great prophecy of Psalm chapter 22, verse 18. But Luke wrote this in such a way, it says here that Jesus was saying, it's the idea that he was repeatedly saying. He didn't just say this once, but I believe the way Luke wrote this is to convey the idea that during this whole process, Jesus was saying, "Father," drove one nail down in through his wrist into the wood. He said, "Father, forgive them." As they drove another nail into his other hand, he again said, "Father, forgive them." As they placed that one foot on top of the other and drove the spike down through there, he cried out again, "Father, forgive them." As he's hanging on the cross, he is repeatedly saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And this one sentence prayer that Jesus said over and over and over again proves one undeniable fact: Jesus gracious. And as all this is happening, we see a couple attitudes that begin to emerge from the people who are around that day. And the first attitude that we see here is the rejection of grace. That there were some who were there that day and they were witnessing what was happening. They heard Jesus praying this prayer, and yet they rejected the grace that was being shown to them. And so in verse number 35, Luke wrote this. He said, "And the people stood by looking on, and even the rulers were sneering at him." The Romans encouraged, because of this public spectacle, they encouraged people to show up and to taunt those who were being crucified to add to their humiliation. And so there's a bunch of people standing by, and of course Jesus was such a polarizing figure of his day that the religious leaders are standing there and they're sneering at him. That's not a word we use much anymore in the English language. It's the idea that they were mocking him. And their mocks were given out of ignorance. Because look at what they were saying. "And the people stood by looking on, and even the rulers were sneering at him, saying, 'He saved others, let him save himself, if this is the Christ of God, his chosen one.'" They were missing the whole point of what was happening here. They were mocking him and saying, "All right, you saved these other people, you forgave people of their sins. If you truly are the Christ, if you're the chosen one, if you're the Messiah, then why can't you save yourself?" Again, they're words of ignorance, because if Jesus had come down off the cross, it would prove the exact opposite. He remained on the cross to show sinful humanity for the rest of eternity that he was the Christ. He was the chosen one. He was the Messiah who was going to die on a cross to pay the penalty of the sins of all mankind. And he lived a life that you and I could not live, and then ultimately died a death that you and I deserve because of his graciousness. And then Luke went on, and it wasn't just the religious leaders that day. In verse 36, the soldiers also mocked him. Now, Luke used a different Greek word here to describe what the soldiers were saying. This word is literally translated, they trifled with him. They didn't see Jesus anything more than just a novelty. And so they mocked him, and they came up to him, offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." They thought they were being funny. And this is some type of great savage humor, right? When you consider that through all of this, Jesus is hanging on the cross and he's speaking directly to these people and he's saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And yet they are ridiculing him and mocking him, sneering at him. And in verse 38, now there was also an inscription above him, "This is the King of the Jews." Which again is just Pilate piling on here and mocking. It was written in 3 different languages, Aramaic and Latin and Greek. It was to make a universal declaration of the identity of Jesus. But little did Pilate know that in his mocking, he was actually confirming that Jesus is the rightful and the ultimate king. And not only was it religious leaders and the soldiers, but Luke went on in verse 39 and wrote, one of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him. Again, Luke used a different word here, and this word is a word that is transliterated into English, blaspheme. It means to say something derogatory about God. And here, this criminal, he is blaspheming him. He's blaspheming the name of God, and how he's doing it. He's joining in with the chorus of the people who are standing around there. And he writes, and he said, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." You can hear, right, the sarcasm dripping from this rhetorical question. And likely, if these criminals who are on the cross were associates of Barabbas, they too were insurrectionists. They were likely what they were called in that day. They were called zealots. And they were people who were fed up with Roman authority over them, and they wanted to do nothing more than to get rid of the Romans. And they kept hearing about one who was going to come one day. He was going to be the Messiah. He was going to set God's people free. And then Jesus shows up and he claims to be this king. He claims to be this Messiah. But yet it looks like he's not defeated the Romans. It looks like the Romans have defeated him. And so in his rhetorical question, which could also be translated, "You've just proven you're not the one." Because if you were the one, you wouldn't find yourself hanging on a cross. You would be out there fighting and overthrowing the Romans and setting us free. So you cannot be the Christ. There's no way you can save yourself, and there's no way that you can save us. And I just want you to understand the scene that is happening that day. Jesus is hanging on the cross and he's being sneered at, he's being mocked, he's being ridiculed, he's being blasphemed. And according to Luke's words, as those people are saying that, Jesus only responds with, "Father, forgive them." In their sneering at him, he responded by saying, "Father, forgive them." In their mocking of him, he said, "Father, forgive them." As a thief, as a criminal on the cross blasphemed him, he said, "Father, forgive them." And even today, there's people who just reject the grace of Jesus. They ridicule it. There's people who mock it. There's people who blaspheme God, but all in all, they're just people who just outright reject the grace of Jesus. But even in the face of all of that rejection, we see that Jesus is gracious. But there was another attitude there present that day, and it wasn't just a rejection to Jesus' grace, but secondly, we see a request for grace. There was a lone voice calling out among the sea of rejection that was just simply making a request to receive the grace of Jesus. Luke wrote it this way: as the one criminal is blaspheming Jesus as he's hanging on the cross, verse number 40, but the other criminal answered and rebuked him and said, do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? He rebuked him, called him out on it. And basically, he said to him, don't you, you are on the doorstep of death right now. We're not coming down off this cross alive. In just a matter of hours, you and I are both going to be dead. This life is going to be over. And don't you understand that when this life's over, we're going to have to go stand one day before God? Don't you fear that? Don't you have any sense about what's going to happen after this life? And so the second criminal continued, and he said, and we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. He owns it. He said, hey, we deserve this, but what I have heard about this Jesus, the way in which he healed people, the way he rebuked the religious leaders, the way the down and out and the outcasts of society were drawn to him and he loved them. And even while we're hanging here on this cross, and all I can hear him say over and over again to all the mocking and the ridicule is that he just wants them to be forgiven. Hasn't it occurred to you that this man has done nothing wrong? He doesn't deserve this. And as he comes to his senses in verse 42, he was saying, Jesus, remember me. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. Again, Luke used grammar here that indicates that this was not just one statement said once. It was one statement said repeatedly. That probably until Jesus breathed his last, this criminal was saying, remember me. Remember me. Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, remember me. Now, notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, Jesus, remember that I stood up for you while we were here on the cross. He didn't say, Jesus, remember how I turned my life around here. He didn't say, Jesus, remember just the good things that I've done in my life. He just simply throws himself on the grace of Jesus, and he said, Jesus, I'm just asking you in your graciousness, just remember me. And the response that he gives to this criminal is almost unbelievable. And he said to him, in verse 43, he said to him, this is Jesus, said to the criminal, truly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. We could almost understand if Jesus had said, it's too late for you. If you consider all the bad things that you've done in your life, they're just too insurmountable to overcome. You're hanging here on the cross as a criminal, as an evildoer. What hope do you have? That's not anything Jesus said. Jesus responded in grace and said to this man who had just simply pleaded for grace, today you shall be with me in paradise. What I'm about to tell you, I just imagine from putting things in the scriptures together. But Jesus died before the other criminals. And so the criminal would have hung there on the cross, and he would have heard Jesus next to him cry out, Tetelestai, it is finished. There's nothing that needs to be repaid. It's been paid in full. And after Jesus said that word, he looked and Jesus bowed his head and he was dead. And this criminal knew that within just maybe a matter of minutes, within an hour, he too would be dead. And as that last breath escaped out of the criminal's body, and his lifeless body hung on the cross, he was immediately transported to heaven, where he stands even today with Jesus, who is gracious. Because what we see from all the words that were said back and forth and the events of the cross, they scream to us, Jesus is gracious. And I think as you read through this, as we read through these verses, I think there's two great principles of grace that every single one of us in this room need to remember. And the first one is this, is that Jesus' grace is never earned. There's nothing that criminal did to earn the grace of Jesus. He didn't go to church. He wasn't baptized. He had never taken communion. He didn't give money to the less fortunate. There was nothing that he did. Now, if you're sitting here and you would say to yourself, I'm going to go to heaven because and whatever you fill in the blank with after that, is not grace. Because our salvation is never dependent upon what we have done, how we have performed. It's not dependent upon what we can achieve. Grace is unmerited, unearned kindness and favor. And the grace of Jesus is unearned and it's unmerited in our lives. And that unearned, unmerited kindness and goodness and love was demonstrated finally, fully, and forever at the cross, where he showed his love and his grace to me and to you. So it's never earned. The second principle we see here is that Jesus' grace is never exhausted. Maybe you're someone who's sitting here and you're saying, if you knew what I have done, if you knew what I have said, if you knew what I have been thinking, you would say I'm evil. And there's no way Jesus could forgive that. There's no way that Jesus' grace could overcome that. Look what happened at the cross. One who was likely a murderer, a marauder, an insurrectionist, probably had been a bad dude for most of his adult life. And Jesus showed him grace. So Jesus' grace is never earned. It's never exhausted. And so because that is true, what should you and I do? And here's what I would encourage every single one of us. I don't care if you're a believer, you're not a believer, understand this. Do not strive for what Jesus has supplied. Don't try to earn God's acceptance. Don't strive for those things, what Jesus has already supplied for you. He's given you your grace, because this is the one truth that separates Christianity from every other religious system in the world. Grace. Because every other religious system in the world will tell you this: if you want to achieve acceptance with God or get to heaven or experience paradise, then you have to perform. You'll have to keep the 10 Commandments. You'll have to make a trip to Mecca. You'll have to wash in the Ganges River. You'll have to go on a 2-year mission trip. You'll have to make sure that you give to the less fortunate. You'll have to be kind. You'll have to be a good person. And all of it is built upon performance, and it's all summed up in this little 2-letter word, do. You got to do something. Christianity is different. Christianity is different in the fact that Christianity is built upon grace. It's built upon this word, done. It's been done. When Jesus died on the cross, everything that needed to be done was done at the cross. And all we do now is experience the grace of God. That's why in Ephesians chapter 2, we're told, for by grace you have been saved through faith. That not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. We're saved by the grace of God through the faith in what he has done for us. And it's as easy as A, B, C. Look what happened to the criminal on the cross. First thing he did was admit, he said, what we're getting here, we deserve this. I have been a criminal. I've just been a bad dude. You and I deserve this. He admitted. The second thing he did is he believed. He believed Jesus was who he said he was. And he said, this man has done nothing wrong. He is the Messiah. He is the one who came into the world promised by God. So you admit your sin. You believe that Jesus is who he said he is. And then the final step is to commit. And that's exactly what he did, right? He didn't trust in his performance. He didn't trust in what he could do. He just simply committed his life to the fact of Jesus was going to be gracious to him. And he said, today, remember me. Just remember me. And we see here that Jesus is gracious. So do not strive for what Jesus has supplied. And trust me on this. You will be glad that you did. I want to end here. A few years ago, Scottish pastor Alistair Begg was at Baylor University. He was preaching in Baylor's chapel. And he preached a sermon entitled, The Man on the Middle Cross. And maybe you've seen this clip. I guess it's been floating around social media and stuff. But I just want to share it with you. It kind of really encapsulates everything that we talked about here today.
If you were to die tonight and you were getting entry into heaven, what would you say? If you answer that, and if I answer it in the first person, we've immediately gone wrong. Because I believed, because I have faith, because I am this, because I am continuing. Loved ones, the only proper answer is in the third person, because he. Think about the thief on the cross. What an immense, I can't wait to find that fellow one day to ask him, how did that shake out for you? Because you were cussing the guy out with your friend. You'd never been in a Bible study. You never got baptized. You didn't know a thing about church membership. And yet you made it. You made it. How did you make it? That's what the angel must have said. What are you doing here? Well, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, because I don't know. Well, excuse me, let me get my supervisor. You go get the supervisor, Ranger. So, wait, just a few questions for you. First of all, are you clear on the doctrine of justification by faith? The guy said, I never heard of it in my life. And what about, let's just go to the doctrine of Scripture immediately. This guy's just staring. And eventually in frustration, he says, on what basis are you here? And he said, the man on the middle cross said, I can come. Now, that is the only answer. That is the only answer. If you were to die tonight and...
The man on the middle cross said I could come because Jesus is gracious. Father, we thank you today. We thank you for your grace in our lives. I pray that all of us in this room, that we would leave here understanding your immense grace. I pray for any who may be here and have never trusted you as your Savior. I pray that they would come and seek me out, or Pastor John or someone from the church, so we can share with them how they could have their sins forgiven, experience your grace in their lives. I pray for those of us as believers. I pray that as we leave here today, as we approach this week in which we set aside and contemplate and consider all that was done for our salvation, may we walk in the confidence that comes only because of your grace in our lives. And so I pray that you would speak and move in us, and that we would leave here as people who are thankful for your graciousness towards us. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.